Good afternoon from the lockdown shed. This is a little garden office that we built last spring 2020. My name's Henry Viner Brooks. I'm the author of this book. So this is like to mark the 1 week of the book being published, and I'd like to read the introduction because episode 2 of the documentary is going to be another week while we just kind of mix it and colour grade the footage and get the audio right. So, introduction, the two witnesses. July 1950. The lengthening shadows of a July afternoon reach from a makeshift platform across to Luxeuil Abbey. The crowds hush and the tannoy whistles momentarily as one of the leading politicians of the age rises to speak. Around him are many eminent European statesmen. He has called them to this abbey in central France for a conference, or more precisely a piece of sacramental political theatre. This is 1950, and Robert Schumann is about to call up the spirit of a 6th century Irish monk in the fight to save Europe from an apocalyptic Third World War. St. Columban, who founded this abbey, was eventually extradited from the region as a troublemaking immigrant, and now, 13 centuries later, a French foreign secretary will use this Irish émigré as a poster child for the most daring political project since the League of Delos unified the Greek city-states. Schumann clears his throat and approaches the microphone. In that pause between breaths, the politicians of Europe hear a collared dove cooing somewhere near them in the lime trees. For the briefest of moments, they look up, as all Europe looks up. And together they discern the sound that a very few years back they thought they would never hear again. It is the dove of peace. We shall return to this moment in chapter 16, but suffice to say for now, it is the improbability of the personalities involved in this epoch-making event that form the grist of our story. And with that said, let us now begin by fast-forwarding to the same month, 66 years later. Subsection: July 2016, Britain. In the French language, everything that is good is feminine. But even they refer to our departure from the European Union as le Brexit, which is rather touching when you come to think about it. For good or evil, Britain did leave the EU with a moderate trade deal at the dawn of 2021. And during the long and acrimonious divorce from 2016 to 2021, I decided to do what I had not had time to do during the furore of the referendum. I wanted to take a look through the long telescope of history and to ask the questions that I could not quite articulate during the hubbub of the referendum. Like others, I found it hard at times to differentiate between being European and being in the EU. Nevertheless, I still wanted to understand what, if anything, was so special about this group of nations that we call Europe. Furthermore, what was the philosophical and the historical consciousness that formed such a singular culture and civilization? How many strands of memory, sociological, legal, ethnic, historical and religious, bound us together? And of course, how much of this, if anything, would be affected by our leaving? Now, the islands of Britain have always stood in a peculiar relation to their neighbours, for good or ill, and sometimes both at once. But how much have we Britons helped to make them who they are over the last 2,000 years, and how much have they made us who we are? In 2017, these questions and many others haunted me. I, like many, had felt deeply inadequate to vote on something so momentous when I was so ignorant. And even though that moment has passed, I still believe that this book could go some way to help us post-Brexit Brits to appreciate not just our own unique position in the European story, but also the depth and richness of our neighbours' stories that still define us. Like the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, my hope is to achieve some level of self-understanding by means of understanding others. An island like ours on the edge of a great landmass must not only exalt, but also conquer a remoteness of outlook. This Anglo-Celtic archipelago must overcome a dual distance, firstly between itself and its European partners, and secondly between itself and its own history. Whatever the next decade will be for Britain, surely it cannot be a time of geographical and historical parochialism. A regiment may move some distance from its allies, but it cannot be severed from the supply train at the same time. Some speak as if our only concern should be economic. Brexit will certainly do many things, and one may be able to shake us out of our present rootless amnesia and send us searching for the great supply train of our rich history. People with dementia cannot plan for the future, says philosopher Alain de Botton. Herein lies a great part of our challenge, to re-engineer our cultural amnesia. 543 to 1963, Columban and Schumann. This book makes tentative steps to address both tasks. My modus vivendi may seem unorthodox at first glance, but there is method in it. I want to follow two eyewitnesses, an Irish monk and a French politician, who, to my mind at least, form key historical markers at either end of the European or our European consciousness. This consciousness first arose after the collapse of the Roman Empire, then finally took root in the rubble of two nigh-apocalyptic world wars. In observing these two witnesses within the crucible of two dark ages, we catch a greater perspective of our own dilemma. Both eyewitnesses are extraordinary yet relatively unknown men who, by their tenacity and, dare I say, humility, played key roles in saving the European civilization of their own day. We talk about it, but these men literally move the hour hand of history. The first, as already mentioned, is a 6th century Irish monk, Columban, who often found himself acting as a reluctant statesman. The second is the 20th century French statesman, Robert Schumann, who very nearly became a monk. This book will be our TARDIS, and in it we will travel chapter by chapter up and down the time corridor like Doctor Who, back and forth between two dark ages, two epochs, two unsung heroes. Caught as they were between the great hinges of history, and as we are between amnesia and memory, maybe we shall eventually return to the 21st century with a new perspective. The first is Columban, or Columbanus, 543 to 615. Patron saint of bikers and the bad boy of medieval monasticism. More dissenter than revolutionary, Columban was a poet, a preacher, a prophet, a polemicist, a scholar, and saint. Alongside Charlemagne, Columbanus has been referred to as the greatest man of the Middle Ages. His surviving literary corpus alone places him head and shoulders above his contemporaries as the first great Irishman of letters. But it is as a monastic founder that we owe him the greatest debt. He undertook a voluntary exile from his homeland, and through a missionary odyssey in France, Germany, Austria and Switzerland, finally came to a valley in Italy that Hemingway declaimed the loveliest in the world. The 5 houses he founded on the continent multiplied to perhaps as many as 200 Schottenkloster, or Irish monasteries, that became critical in the preservation and the transmission of scholarship, faith and literacy over the next 2 crucial centuries. In fact, nearly all surviving 7th and 8th century manuscripts from continental Europe are directly due to this one man's monastic legacy. He was also the first of his countrymen to express an Irish sense of identity in writing, and the first to articulate for us the concept of a united Europe, making reference to Totius Europea Flacentius Augustissimus, all of decaying Europe, in a letter to the Pope. About the same time, and using biblical metaphor, in a letter to the disgruntled Frankish bishops, he even gives a Christian basis for a supranational understanding between European nations. He says, "We are all members of one body, whether Franks or Britons or Irish or whatever our race." So even as far back as 600 AD, when Europe was still reeling from the barbarian migrations, and 50 years after a plague that halved Europe's population, we have this Irish immigrant, claiming openly that we Western Europeans already owe each other an allegiance that supersedes, though not replaces, racial and national identity. The historian Norman Davies wrote that Columbanus was the first to conceive of Europe as a civilizational unit centered on Rome. According to the medieval scholar Dr. Alex O'Hara, Columban was also, quote, a forceful advocate for unity and tolerance in the divisive and violent world of his day. As an immigrant in the heart of Europe, he pleaded for toleration and accommodation. His example had a surprising influence on Robert Schuman, the post-war French foreign minister and architect of the modern European Union. Moving on to Schuman, Robert Schuman, 1886 to 1963. Robert Schuman is the second eyewitness whose life and times I wish to retell in this book. Schuman broke out of Nazi incarceration after 7 months in solitary confinement, evaded the Gestapo in a daring solo escape across the Vosges Mountains, and then rose precariously after the war to become the French foreign minister and founding father of the EEC. His life and that of 2 other co-founders form, at least from a historical novelist point of view, one of the most thrilling, moving and uplifting stories in any political history of any era. Both Columban and Schuman were men of a steely determination. Neither ever married, and both came to the major work of their lives in middle age, which should give some of us hope. In some nebulous way, they form the brackets or the bookends of the European experiment. Columban at the inception of totius Europaea, as he called it, and Schuman at the cementation of that pan-national fiction into a political and economic reality. Another subsection, 2016 to 2020, this book, which is basically my handling of the material and the subject. The ancient Greek writer Lucian advises that a historian among his books should forget his nationality, but frankly, that sort of position which so characterized the Enlightenment's prejudice against prejudices has itself been given such a thorough drubbing in the 20th centuries by scholars like Gadamer that one has to wonder whether the objectivity of the natural science is desirable, let alone possible, in the humanities. Of course, I have tried to be as open-handed with the sources as any red-blooded Englishman can be, and at the end of the day, Anglocentrism is not a sin, not in the north of England at any rate. So I bring a personal view about the evolution of Western European civilization, gazing intently as I do from the great de finibus extremis of that landmass. I am conscious that my necessarily restricted Western Latin European focus might strike the broader scholar as too occidental, too reflective of a limited Enlightenment historiography, but where I am able, I will pay my respects to African influence when discussing Antony and the Desert Fathers and Augustine in chapters 1 and 2, and the influence of the East in chapters 1 and 15. I must confess up front that I have also not given equal wordage to the 3 great stages through which European culture has passed. The early stages of pagan Rome and the Christian formation will receive vastly more wordage than the Enlightenment, partly because the latter is so well established, but also because the former is so little understood and appreciated among popular readers. This fact was rather visually illustrated to me in the September of 2018, when I was very kindly received at the House of European History in Brussels to film an interview with the director, Dr. Constance Itzel. This extraordinary and brilliant museum is well worth a whole day's visit, though the display ratios embrace the glaring bias of a European consciousness grounded almost solely in the Enlightenment. Having literally just travelled to Brussels from Aachen that day, at the former centre of the Carolingian European Union in the 8th century, this did strike me as strange. It is rather like pointing to a cake that's just coming out of the oven and exclaiming, "Oh look, that oven has just made a cake." It acknowledges an important process in the cake's production, but shows that I have only just entered the kitchen. Now, the fires of that industrial age certainly produce much heat, and perhaps some light too, but in this book I invite you to join me on a journey much further back, to sample some of the raw ingredients, as it were, and to read the recipe books, perhaps even meet one or two chefs. I, as a northern Brit, have come to this subject like Columban came to the continent, from de finibus extremis, that extreme fringe. And like Columban, who journeyed south, east and west, so I too have struck out overland, following my literary sources, looking for clues and narratives. My sources, like his monastic band, are from diverse nations: Franks, Lombards, Scotti, Alemanni, etc. And with them I have crossed and recrossed borders, heard their languages, enjoyed their cultures. In his excellent 2015 book Silk Roads, Peter Frankopan sought to recenter European readers geographically. But the book you are holding now attempts something comparable in the more fundamental realms of spirituality and philosophy. And if there might be a European position from which to judge these things, or at least a Western European one, perhaps we could claim it for Robert Schumann, this homme de frontière, born between France and Germany, and who was a mix of both geographically, biologically, linguistically and culturally. In his person and his policies, Schumann became the essential bridge between both at a critical hour. But even his developed position could not be seen as a bridge between the Enlightenment and the Romantics, between Kant and Hegel, for Schumann's unassuming humanism, so extraordinarily assured and productive, was a stranger synthesis than any might guess. More medieval than modern, more rooted in Aquinas than Rousseau, more indebted to the socio-political writings of the popes than the purveyors of the new ideologies, he was an enigma to many in his day and would probably be an anathema to ours. Stranger still, his worldview was quite independently shared by his political counterparts in Italy and Germany. And in a paradox worthy of an epigram, it was the neo-scholastic humanism of Schumann, Adenauer and de Gasperi that made possible what Javier Solana called the most innovative and successful integration process in the history of humankind. In the midst of the modern amnesia, they reach back further and in so doing achieve something more progressive than the progressives ever dreamt, and more pragmatic than the pragmatists ever compromised for. Answering journalists' questions after his famous declaration on May 9, 1951, Schumann quietly admitted before them all that it was a leap into the unknown, and yet he and others were able to lead the shattered nations through that unmarked door. This is a simplistic analysis, and really only one that is intended to whet the reader's appetites for something rich and unexpected. Admittedly, these great men, and some very notable women who made and supported them, are not known well in Britain, and certainly not as they should be. When Alexander the Great reached Achilles' tomb, he said, "Happy are you, young man, for you will have the benefit of a great spokesman of your achievement." Alexander knew he couldn't find a man of Homer's ilk to write his epitaph, and nor have Columbanus and Schumann through these efforts of mine. Columban was actually the first Irishman to be the subject of biography, and fortunately for us, it was written only shortly after his death. But alas, Schumann has no biography available in English at present, and nor does de Gasperi, who we will also meet in these pages. Columban's sense of his own inadequacy sums up my own dilemma perfectly. Who could listen to a greenhorn? Who is this bumptious babbler who dares to write such things unbidden? I appreciate that our age demands specialism, but it also desperately needs synthesis too. Those of us blue-collar scholars who serve falteringly in the latter capacity will always face the accusation of superficiality, arrogance and dilettantism. To the specialist philosophers, historians, sociologists, economists and others, I ask a very special clemency. For I have trespassed through many areas of scholarship without so much as wiping my feet. This story, which we have either forgotten or lost, must be retold, even if retold this imperfectly. This I say with all humility, for unlike others qualified in these fields of study, I have so much more to be humble about. To the general reader, I also offer a very Columban confession. Talia confragosa loca. I come from a rough place. Far removed from the refinements of academia and the urban intelligentsia, I live in the far northwest of our island, a place where the Roman legions once defended the very borders of known civilization, and where the shepherds still count in Old Norse. In fact, I live very literally under the shadow of England's highest mountains, and in a figure I wish to lead the reader, as I have led many other visiting friends over the years, along precipitous ridges and through upland environments unfamiliar to them. I recently took my Flatlander Norfolk nephews along the infamous Striding Edge that yearly claims lives and where the adventurer is usually only ever one step away from death. Now there is an underpath to the left and to the right, but those who walk them inevitably only see half the view. And I don't mean this as merely an aesthetic choice. I remember as a boy taking the underpath with my father during a winter whiteout because the snow, ice and violent winds made the ridge too dangerous. But even in this event, we overshot the end of the ridge and found ourselves making a hazardously steep ascent, arriving in just under the summit. But for the ropes, ice axes and crampons, even the safe underpath might have killed us. But my main point here is that at various points, depending on your political or religious leaning, you might earnestly long for the underpath of your persuasion. And at those points, you will inevitably feel the strength of the metaphorical rope pulling you off your normal centre. Let it be so in good faith, friend, even for a short time. My real sympathy on this hike is with the agnostic and non-religious reader. By virtue of the very subjects under consideration, this climb will take you on paths very seldom trodden. From you I ask a very special trust and patience. Where I have been unjust, obtuse, and just plain wrong, please forgive and correct me. My intention was to create a basis for further dialogue, not entrenchment. Having said all that, I do not doubt that even Christian readers will also find certain sections a stiff scramble. We are a recalcitrant breed of mountaineer, scrupulous over our maps and high-tech gear, but unfamiliar with the vast mountain ranges beyond our neighbourhood. Poor us. With the titans like Schumann and Columbanus, we will be forced to breathe the thin mountain air of Catholic aesthetics, and even have some cherished Protestant myths about the Celtic Church overturned. And even Catholic readers will have to suffer the interpretations and criticisms of a sympathetic but non-Catholic pen. And for the Christian readers of the next generation, I want this book to be a seedbed of inspiration for cultural engagement beyond the church door. Readers from other world religions will find plenty to interest them, but alas, nothing that speaks of their faith's contributions to Europe's richly diverse culture. Again, my apologies. This was purely for brevity's sake and for focus. My comments regarding Islamism, demography and migration form the very briefest survey of mainstream scholarly literature and are not intended as a basis for racism or xenophobia, but rather for further dialogue. So again, my only plea is that you all have patience with the path I've paced out. I hold out my hands, left and right. Let us climb together, grumbling where necessary, but nevertheless keeping in step with our fellow adventurers. For I believe that the view is amply worth the journey. And so I close this section with Columban's plea 1400 years ago. If any of my words have outwardly caused offence to pious ears, pardon me for my treatment of such rugged passages. And for the freedom of my custom, so to speak, it was in part the cause of my boldness. For among us it is not who you are, but how you make your case that counts. So that's all from me this week. I hope you enjoy chapter 2 of the documentary when it comes out. Please get this book. It's coming out shortly in hardback, in softback as well. This hardback edition's 20 quid on Amazon, and I think you'll find it certainly a good read. If you don't like it, give it to someone you don't like for Christmas. Thanks for watching.